Good morning, sir. Our group project explores the history of pandemics and how they shaped human population, state power, and commercial development. So this is our whole poster. This is our whole poster. Our poster covers five most major pandemics, each showing how disease permanently transformed civilization. I will be speaking about the first section, ecology and history, focusing specially on the Black Death. Okay. So, in the introduction, let me ask you a special question. What killed more people than any war in human history? Is it a bomb? No, it's not a bomb, not an army, a bacterium, the Black Death. But the most important analytical point I want to make today is this: the Black Death was not an accident. Pandemics are not the random offspring of chance. They are the result of complex intermerging of human mobility, social organization, and ecological desperation. The ecological and climate roots, most people think of the Black Death as a purely medical disaster. So, purely medical disaster, but environmental historians have proven it was an ecological event. In the early 14th century, Eurasia experienced deep climate changes, especially the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, crops failed, and natural rodent populations on the Central Asian steppe were disrupted, pushing infected animals closer to human settlements. Because of cooler weather and famine, human populations suffered reduced nutritional and immunological defenses. The Silk Road trading route then acted as a biological bridge, allowing the pathogen Yersinia pestis to travel from its natural habitat into the densely populated centers of the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. If you look at image 1 on our poster, you can trace the exact geographic spread. It originated in Central Asia around 1338, marched along the Silk Road, hit Sicily by 1347, and swept through Europe and Middle East by 1351. The spread of the Black Death was dictated entirely by the degree of human interconnectedness. As William McNeill argued in the 1976 book Plagues and Peoples, infectious diseases have functioned throughout history as decisive ecological forces, exploiting the very conditions of trade and population density that societies built to sustain themselves. Furthermore, Skimmett and colleagues in their 2015 study proved that repeated plague outbreaks in Europe were driven directly by climate fluctuations. In Asia, it was a climatically sustained ecological process. Then let me talk about selective mortality and biological vulnerability. The second major theme is about who the plague killed. Bioarchaeology reveals that pandemic deaths are not socially neutral events. Dr. Sharon DeWaiter, in her 2014 study of skeletal remains from medieval London cemeteries, found that the Black Death produced a selective mortality effect. It did not kill randomly. It disproportionately killed those who already showed signs of psychological stress, nutritional deficiency, and chronic illness. Now, let me come to the point three. There's brutal painting on my poster, not point three, sorry, image three. This reality is captured here in image three is brutal painting showing mass suffering. The people who perished were the psychologically weak from the outset due to nutritional insecurity, overwork, and poor housing, all products of the feudal social fabric. In Dewaiter's words, the plague was highly selective with respect to biological vulnerability is socially produced. The inequality the plague revealed was already written on the bones of the poor. Let me come to the point three, the COVID-19 parallel. This breeze us to a profound cross-temporal continuity. Ben Sheikh and Dewey in their 2020 comparative study demonstrated that this exact condition of frailty was a structurally consistent predictor of mortality risks in both the Black Death and COVID-19. 7 centuries of scientific advancement later, both pandemics scale along the lines of pre-existing inequality, as long as social and ecological factors perpetuate structural vulnerability. The mortality landscapes of pandemics will simply reflect and reinforce our prevailing social hierarchies. So let's come to the point 4, a catalyst for civilizational transform. Finally, what happens after the dying spots? The changes that follow a pandemic are not accidental surprises, they are structural necessities. First, the economic transformation that we can see at the image both 2 and the topics I have talked in the assignment. With a 30 to 50% population drop, the balance of power shifted. Surviving peasants suddenly had demographic leverage. They demanded higher wages and mobility, radically changing their feudal order. As historian Samuel Cohn notes in his 2023 study, this labor scarcity forced a new organization of the European commercial system, sparking the early developments of a mercantile capitalism. Secondly, religious authority crumbled. As you can see in image 2, the clergy were present but powerless. The failure of prayer to quell the plague signals a massive crisis in authority, leading to the gradual loss of the church institutional legitimacy. Third, the modern state was born. In 1377, the city of Ragusa established the world's first quarantine system. This was historically unprecedented, a secular government claiming the right to control human mobility for collective biological safety. It was the birth of biosecurity. So let me come to the conclusion. To conclude, an ecological and social understanding of the Black Death is vital to understand for the human civilization as a whole. Pandemics are ecologically produced in the world. Their mortality is socially differential, and their consequences are institutionally transformative. The Black Death is not just a relic of the Middle Ages, it's a mirror showing us how human societies create the condition for their own crisis. So we can relate these situations. The thing I have talked about Black Death, we can compare it to COVID-19 that we witnessed not not that much ago in the duration of 2020 to 2022. So this case was totally similar. Men usually become helpless on that kind of situation of the pandemics, both in Black Death and the COVID-19. So exactly, that's what I wanted to say in the whole presentation. Thank you all. Thank you, sir. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Hello, I am Sadman Shahryar Sporsho, and today I will be presenting on the origin of the Black Death and what it reveals about the Mongol Empire. We all know one-third of Europe's population died between 1346 and 1353, and for centuries no one knew where this plague came from. Today I will show you how we finally found the answer and what it tells us about the Mongol Empire. So, before 2022, according to my literature review, Robert Hymes published a hypothesis in 2014, as he believed that the plague emerged in the early 13th century around the time when the Mongols were invading the Shishia state. His evidence came from popular records, as at that time northern China saw a sharp population decline, and Hymes argued that the plague was the cause. But here is the problem. He had no physical evidence, no ancient DNA, and no confirmed plague bacteria from the 13th century. His argument was smart, but it was theoretical, and it was not his fault, because before 2022, direct evidence simply didn't exist. That changed in 2022, as a team of researchers went to Kyrgyzstan and found two tombstones that were dated in 1338 and 1339. And some of the tombstone literally said the word pestilence. The team extracted the DNA from the teeth of the buried individuals. They found a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused the plague, and they proved that the strain was the direct ancestor of Black Death that later devastated Europe. They traced the origin of the Tian Shan Mountains right on the border of eastern Kyrgyzstan and northwestern China. This wasn't just theoretical, this was direct proof. So, what changed? Before 2022, the only question scholars could ask was, where do historical records suggest the plague might have started? The questions can now produce guesses. After 2022, a different question emerged. What does direct genetic evidence confirm about the specific time and place of the pandemic's emergence? That question demands proof that this transformation is the paradigm shift, and the study itself acknowledges this. The authors mention that the earlier outbreak attributions remain to be explored. This is a direct reference to Hymes, as his hypothesis is not wrong, it was just unsupported by current evidence. Now, what does this have to do with the Mongol Empire? In the textbook, they describe that the Mongols have brought far-flung parts of the world together. It talked about Marco Polo traveling the Silk Road and how Ibn Battuta crossed the Islamic world. This is the traditional story that we all knew, but the Black Death evidence forces a different understanding. The same Mongol road network that carried Marco Polo to China is the same exact network that carried the plague to Europe. The same policies that protected the merchants also paved the way for the fleas and the rats to travel with them. This empire did not only connected civilizations, it also connected death. Now, this textbook also marked a very important point. It said that the Mongols unintentionally unleashed the Black Death through the network that they have built, the Silk Road. But ultimately, the Mongols did not mean to spread the plague, as they built the road for trade and not for the germs to travel. They were meant to protect the merchants. This tragedy does not mean that the Mongols were evil and that they intentionally caused this, because at the end of the day, this interconnection between the continent was their greatest achievement, but it had a consequence no one had ever predicted. And here is the logical sequence. First, the Mongols unified Eurasia and built trade networks. Secondly, these trade networks enabled the plague to spread from Kyrgyzstan to rest of Eurasia. Thirdly, the plague weakened both the Yuan dynasty in China and the Ilkhanate in Persia. Fourth, both empires collapsed within decades of the plague's arrival. The Mongol rule in China finally fell in 1368. The Mongol rule in Persia collapsed even earlier. The textbook mentioned that in China and in Persia, the Mongol rule collapsed in the 14th century, the same exact century the plague arrived. The empire that is responsible for unifying Eurasia was undone by the very infrastructure that made the unification possible. So, here's the real lesson from the paradigm shift. Not just a better date or a better location, but a more honest understanding of what the Mongol Empire actually was. The Silk Road cannot be celebrated without acknowledging the uh, plague that traveled along the Silk Road. The empire was a bridge between the worlds, but unintentionally a gateway through which the Black Death traveled. This was not a judgment on the Mongols, it was how history simply worked, as always. Actions have consequences, even when these consequences are invisible, and it is not and it is unintended.
So, my previous group member explained in Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in the world history. The Black Death showed how disease could spread through trade, routes, cities, and human movement, and how it could change population, economy, and state power. Now I will continue with another major disease in world history, smallpox in the Americas during Spanish Portuguese colonization. My topic is smallpox in the Americas 16th century Spanish and Portuguese colonization. In my poster section, I divided the topic into two parts. First part is spread and timeline, and second part is impact and historical significance. First, I will explain the spread and timeline. Smallpox spread in the Americas through Spanish and Portuguese colonized networks. This means the disease did not move randomly. It moved with the activities of colonization. It traveled with ships, soldiers, missionaries, port, forced labor systems, enslaved people, and trade routes. That is why I added the map on my poster. The map shows that smallpox followed colonial routes just like the Black Death spread through connected trade routes in Afro-Eurasia. Smallpox spread through the new Atlantic routes created by European colonization. The first important date is 1518. Around this time, smallpox appeared in the Caribbean, especially Hispaniola. Hispaniola was one of the earliest Spanish colonial areas in the Americas, so it became an important starting point for the spread of smallpox in the New World. The second important date is 1520. In this year, smallpox reached central Mexico during the Spanish conquest of the Mexica or Aztec Empire. This was a very serious moment because the disease arrived during war and conquest. The Spanish were trying to defeat Tenochtitlan, and many indigenous communities were already facing violence, political pressure, and social disruption. The third important area is Portuguese Brazil. In Brazil, major smallpox outbreak happened from 1560s. These outbreaks spread through coastal settlements and mission villages. Portuguese colonization in Brazil was closely connected with ports, Jesuit missions, sugar plantation, and Atlantic trade. So smallpox also moved through those same spaces. Now I will explain the second part of my poster, impact and historical significance. Smallpox weakened indigenous societies in many ways. It damaged leadership, food system, care networks, and military strength. This is important because a pandemic does not only kill individuals, it can weaken the whole structure of society. For example, when many people became sick at the same time, there may not be enough healthy people to care for the sick. There may not be enough people to prepare food, to protect children, organize defense, or continue political leadership. So, smallpox created not only a medical crisis but also social crisis. In the central Mexico, smallpox made Spanish conquest harder to resist, but I want to make one thing clear. Smallpox did not conquer the Americas by itself. Spanish weapons, horses, indigenous allies, political conflict, and military strategies also played very important roles. However, smallpox made the situation worse for indigenous societies. It weakened rulers, warriors, caregivers, food system. Because of this, indigenous resistance became more difficult during critical moments of conquest. On the right side of my poster, I added an image from the Florentine Codex. This image is important because it shows the suffering caused by smallpox in central Mexico. The Florentine Codex describes people suffering from pustules, weakness, hunger, and lack of care. It gives us understand that smallpox was not only a disease of the body, it also damaged community life and systems of care. Another important point is about mission villages. In Portuguese Brazil, Jesuit mission villages gathered indigenous people together in one place. These villages were created for religious conversation and colonial control. But when many people lived close together, disease could spread more easily. So mission village sometimes increased disease transmission. Smallpox also caused indigenous population decline and created labor crisis in colonial society. Spanish and Portuguese colonies depended heavily on labor. In Spanish America, labor was needed for tribute, agriculture, mining, and colonial administration. In Portuguese Brazil, labor was especially important for sugar plantation economy. In Brazil, when the indigenous people declined because of the disease, war, forced labor, hunger, and displacement, colonial partners increasingly relied on enslaved African labor. This does not mean smallpox directly caused African slavery. The Atlantic slave trade grew because of European demand, plantation profit, Portuguese commercial interest, racial exploitation. But smallpox made the indigenous labor crisis worse. So, the historical significance of smallpox is that it changed population, people, and commerce. It weakened indigenous societies, reduced resistance to conquest, and became connected to Atlantic trade and plantation economics. The main idea is that smallpox was a pandemic intensified by empire. It was natural disease, but colonization, war, forced labor, hunger, and displacement made it far from destructive. To conclude, like the Black Death, smallpox shows pandemics are not only medical events, they can reshape human history. In the Americas, smallpox became both a medical and a colonial force. Thank you.
Hello everyone, this is Shweta Matabasum. So today I'm going to talk about cholera in colonial South Asia during the 19th century. So first of all, what is cholera? So cholera is a waterborne illness caused by a gram-negative bacteria called Vibrio cholera, and the cholera that first emerged in Bengal in the early 19th century. But why Bengal? So Bengal had warm rivers, seasonal floods, and a tidal mixing from the Ganges Brahmaputra delta, perfect conditions for the bacteria. You can say that is a five-star hotel for this bacteria. So, however, the scholars showed that it naturally existed in the water systems even before the British arrived. But then the important question arrived, Jay, that how did, if it was already there in the water systems already, how it exploded into a repeated global pandemics in the 19th century. The environment was obviously not the reason because it didn't change in a very small time. it was something else. And what changed was the colonial infrastructure. From around 1817 onwards, the British built railways, canals, and shipping routes across India. The stated purpose was trade and territorial control, essentially. But these same systems gave cholera a transport network it never had before. Think about it like that. One person drank some contaminated water in the railway station and boards a train, travels hundreds of kilometers, and spreads the disease before even he knows he is sick. And water and food shared at stations will become the infection point. Then irrigation canals in North India changed the flow in ways that helped the bacteria survive and spread afterwards. The number tell the story very clearly. One outbreak in in a British army camp once killed 5,000 soldiers in just 5 days. Then look at this image I have put right here. That is basically the table that says the patients treated by native doctors in the Calcutta between September 1817 to January 1818. Over 9,000 people are attacked and 507 are died. This one who never reached the real doctor even. Then now here is what strikes you when you really look at that document. This is a colonial medical report, and this actually made by the British. They saw everything. They had the data. They saw exactly how many people were died day by day, neighborhood by neighborhood, but they didn't do anything. They still chose commerce and trade over the quarantine. So in cities like Calcutta, the British were genuinely terrified of cholera. They were terrified about it if the cholera, the outbreak goes into Europe. So they did what is they started to sanitize their ships and protected them. They inspected European lodging houses in India. They built drainage, clean water systems, and everything to protect themselves. But in the same time, the Indian dock workers were also working in the same dirty water, but the Europeans didn't take any actions for them. The historians describe this is a racialized model of public health. Europeans' bodies were populations to be protected, but Indians were to be neglected. They didn't seen as a victim or like Europeans, rather they seen as a natural sources of this disease. Now look at this image I have put right here, that the two nurses on the floor actually treating an Indian patient. They didn't get even a hospital, a bed, not even a bed. That's what the healthcare looked like for an Indian patient, not a doctor, not even a floor. So now, eventually, British did building sanitization systems, drainage works, municipal thing, and sanitary boards, and urban health regulations. And internationally, cholera forced countries to sit together for the first time and discuss how do we manage a disease that crosses border. Then comes the international sanitary conferences. This first one was in 1861 or 1851. Countries argued about quarantine, trade, and disease control, and this framework, this idea that nations must cooperate on public health. Then comes the WHO, World Health Organization. Yes, we can say that cholera gave us WHO, but that sounds like progress. But in this progress, there was another problem, is that these reforms were never equal. The Europeans was the one in India that used to get that opportunities and everything, not the Indians. So the international conference are mostly designed to protect the European trade routes from disruption, and reform came not because the empire suddenly developed a conscience. It came because epidemics were becoming politically and economically inconvenient. This is not compassion, that's it called damage control. And then came the resistance, the fire of it. In the 1890s, during the plague epidemics, the British introduced very extremely aggressive anti-disease measures where they used to enter into the Indians' home forcefully, and they used to do the bodily inspection without any consent, any type of dignity. This broke something. People had tolerated death after death, but they could not bear this in humiliation. So nationalist writers started openly saying that ordinary people already knew that the disease was not a natural disaster. This was a result of colonial policy, high death rates, absent sanitization, neglected communities. This was not only bad luck, this was governance. So cholera and plague become political weapons against the empire. The anger built, and eventually the British had to lift, and this was the actual result. So cholera in colonial Asia is ultimately a story about one thing: the gap between what a government knows and what it chooses to do. The knowledge was there, their will to protect, but not the Indian lives. Only that mattered in their trade, um, their for their choice. So they chose repeatedly, decade after decade, had consequences that outlasted the empire itself. So lastly, this was not just a disease story; it is a story about power, about who the British decided was worth saving and who decided was not. So thank you. That's all from my side.
Hello everyone, this is me Sauda Alamrosa, and today I will talk about the third plague pandemic. Plague hit the mankind for three times. The first time it was in the 6th century, that was called the plague of Justinian. The second time it was Black Death that hit during the 14th century, and later on during the late 19th century, the third plague pandemic hit. So, the first time the third plague pandemic hit was in Hong Kong, China. During that time, people was not so sure about the causative agents of the plague pandemic, but during the 19th 20th century, technology, medical science flourished so much that eventually the causative agent of plague was discovered, which was the bacteria Yersinia pestis, spreads through flea that remains in the rodents like rats. So this time, today we will focus on the scenario of India, that how third plague pandemic hit this country and resulted in this area. So let's see what the early scenario of India during this outbreak. During that time, India was under the British colonial rule, and the British Empire used the Indian ports for their trades and commerce. India was connected to the Indian Ocean, to the Arabian Sea, which made it easy for trading with different countries. So a ship from Hong Kong came to Indian port in 1896, and that was the first time the infection came to this country. As people was not so sure about this infection and how to maintain or control it, so people become panicked and and the workers and people around the port, the urban areas, started to move to the rural areas, which made the infection spread to the rural areas too. When the news of this spread of infection spread to the different countries, they quarantined the ships from India and to stop the spread of infection in their country, and this resulted the slowdown of trades, and the merchants incurred huge loss. So let's see how the colonial rulers handled this situation. The colonial rulers was not ready to risk their trade and commerce for the spread of this infection. So they started to take drastic steps to control this infection and reduce the spread of it. So firstly, they thought that it was some infection that was spreading because of unhygiene environment and unsanitation. So they started to take measures to to maintain the sanitation and hygiene. So they reduced the crowds in the localities by burning down slums. They started cleaning the roads and drains. Even when it was assumed that the flea spread through the grains, they even burnt down a huge storage of grain that resulted in famine during that time. To control the infection and make people have the proper treatment, they passed an act that was the Epidemic Act of 1897. I'm sorry. That was passed in 1897, and this act helped them to for raiding the houses of Indians without any notice to find any plague patients if any plague patients exist in those houses. The Indians were Hindus, and they had their castes and norms that they followed strictly. But the colonial rulers or the authorities and the physicians also did not maintain those caste and gender. The Indian women were not used to by getting treatment from the male physicians, but they were forcefully treated by males, and even the other plague patients, irrespective of genders, were forced to hospitalize and they were forced to get vaccines. Initially, when the vaccine was developed, the people willingly took vaccines, but that showed too much side effects, as the vaccine formulation was not so good, was not so improved then. But later on, that was improved. But people were panicked for taking the vaccines because of the previous effects they have seen. So let's see what the paradigm shift that was resulted due to the third plague pandemic. So the medical science was developed a lot after this pandemic, because initially or previously people used to think that the pandemics were some result of miasma or wrath of God, that results because of their sin. But after the flourishment of technology and medical sciences, after this pandemic, the medical sciences shifted to bacteriology, and this resulted in the discovery of the causative agent Yersinia pestis. And when the causative agent was discovered, this helped a lot in discovering and developing the vaccines against the infection, and as well as the development of antibiotics by the Second World War. During the Second World War, the first generation antibiotics, penicillin and streptomycin, were discovered, and administration of these two antibiotics resulted in magical results and the reduction of infection by 48 hours, which was a huge development in the medical science. Again, when the colonial rulers cleaned the port areas, the drains with carbolic acid, lime water, this resulted in a hygiene environment development around the port areas and urban areas. And after that time, hygiene and sanitation was not only something optional, rather people had to maintain that to control the infection rate. Here we see that here are the statistics that we see about the death cases from 1896 to 1904 in India, and the blue areas that in the bar charts were the death cases from Bombay only. So since the infection was spread to Bombay first, and death cases were mostly happened in this area. About 10 to 12 million people died due to this pandemic, and the most cases were in Bombay. So let's now see that if the colonial ruler were concerned about the local Indians, or was it something else? The colonial rulers seems to be concerned about the local Indians, but actually they were concerned about their trade and commerce. They couldn't risk it, rather they had to maintain the infection rate, so they could reduce the infection rate and continued their smooth trading, but their over strict measurements resulted in the Indians to get outraged against them, and this ignited the Indian nationalism against the British, which somehow accelerated the downfall of British colonial rule in 1947. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I am Rata Server from section 25 of HUM101, and I will be talking about the role of COVID-19 in shaping the human population and its paradigm shift. It involves the ecological shift, technological shift, and the commercialization. So, moving on to my part, a human coronavirus began a pandemic of severe pneumonia in Wuhan, China in December 2019. The virus was named as SARS-CoV-2 based on the similarity of sequence with SARS-CoV, which was the initial variant. The virus, based on its origin, which is China, is also known as termed as the Chinese virus, which intensified racism, xenophobia, cultural blame, stigma, and discrimination against the Chinese people and people of Asian descent. So the image at the bottom shows a timeline of major COVID-19 variants or mutants from July 2020 to September 2022, showing the emergence of important mutated strains such as Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Omicron, and Delta in different regions of the world in different time spans, which also highlights the global spread and severity of the pandemic, which ultimately resulted in 6.5 million in over 194 countries. So now moving on to the next image, this illustrates the zoonotic transmission of coronavirus. So here bat serves as the primary host or as the natural reservoir of all three lineages. From bat, the virus utilizes the secondary host, which is the civet cats. The SARS-CoV outbreak in China in 2002, which was the first form of the outbreak of coronavirus, was associated with the civet cat. Then the outbreak of MERS-CoV, which is the Middle Eastern COVID virus, coronavirus, in 2012 was associated with close contact with camels. These two were the initial variants of coronavirus, and it's the later, which was the last and the novel coronavirus, was spread from a bad droplet, which transmitted to human, which caused the pandemic. Now, moving on to the ecological shifts, the risk of zoonotic transmission have increased due to the ecological disruption and the globalization. Natural barriers between the human and the wildlife or the nature are now diminishing as a result of deforestation, habitat clearance, agricultural expansion, wildlife trade markets, which led to the increased contact with wildlife. And the risk of zoonotic spillover events also increased. Before the airways, the trading through major trade routes used to transport not only goods but also deadly pathogens from China to Central Asia, Persia, Europe. History has always seen the emergence of outbreaks from pathogen carrying animals moving across the continents through ships, caravans, and international trade. One such deadly consequence is, of course, the COVID-19, which occurred from a spillover event of bats, which originated from China and spread across the Europe, North America, and other parts of the world within weeks by international travel. Another historical example is during the World War I. H1N1 strain of influenza carried by the birds transmitted the virus to humans, which later spread rapidly through troop movements and international and transportation networks in 1918 as the Spanish flu. So the destruction of ecosystem and the loss of biodiversity could lead to more frequent pandemics in the future. That's why the protection of this ecosystem is needed to maintain the global stability. Next is the technological shift that took place amid the crisis. A powerful new technology called artificial intelligence has come to the forefront. AI is the simulation of human intelligence by machines. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, AI has shown potential to enhance the surveillance prediction system and the information dissemination. However, this information was not scientifically verified. AI gave access to information to everybody, which resulted in a diffused knowledge system. Algorithmic systems or the human generated data determine what informations will spread to the billions of people. So The rapid spread of this unverified, dangerously fabricated information results in lack of transparency, which makes it difficult to hold the system accountable. AI system did facilitate some healthcare sectors like the AI-powered thermal scanning and the facial recognition system that was used in major transportation hubs across the major cities, which efficiently detected those with higher than normal temperature and enforced quarantine actions on them. However, the consequence of taking actions on these false informations that circulate around the internet due to the AI would potentially would result in a potential life-threatening cause, like the AI-powered platforms rumor spread rumor about the miracle treatments of COVID-19, like the hydroxychloroquine, and people believed in that. So these misinformations were circulating, and it created a loss of trust among people in the healthcare authorities. So although learning platforms were revolutionized in education, like online education, but there was still a disparity in academic performance for students with low income backgrounds and rural areas who had limited access to internet and stable internet connection and digital devices. Even during the pandemic, when most jobs were shifted online, essential workers didn't have privilege to work from home, which created a new type of social inequality. Due to the need for remote economic activities and reduced contact during transactions, pandemic has accelerated financial digitalization across the globe. So these were all about the technological shift, and commercialization of vaccines also occurred during the pandemic. uh, it sparked the ethical debates about the pharma companies' profits and vaccine inequality, patent ownership, and unequal access to the vaccines across the world. So pharma companies secured agreements with the wealthy people and the elite class or governments for vaccines even before the vaccines were even created. So this hybrid status of the pharma companies as quasi-public actors allowed them to benefit from mass profit, to benefit from massive public investment in research and infrastructure. Also, they refused the request to remove the patent protection that could have permitted production of generic production of vaccines in lower income countries. So, refusal to remove the patent protection resulted in shortage of vaccines in middle and lower income countries. COVID-19 was not only a pandemic, but also a catalyst of social, economic, commercial, and technological, which transformed the human civilization. So that was all from my part. Thank you.